In this PowerPoint, we are going to be focusing on the first 4 learning intentions from page 36 of your student guide. By the end of this PowerPoint, we want to be able to state what glucose is broken down to form during the process of glycolysis, state the location of glycolysis, state what is meant by the term phosphorylation, and compare the energy investment and energy payoff stage of glycolysis with reference to ATP. If we can do a wee bit of a recap here from our National 5 understanding of respiration and compare it to what we'll be looking at over the next couple of PowerPoints with regards to our higher learning. At National 5, we began to look at the process of respiration that involved glucose being broken down to pyruvate in the cytoplasm of the cell. Now, this was controlled by enzymes, and the production of 2 molecules of ATP was as a result of what we call this fermentation pathway. If oxygen was present, the pyruvate could undergo further enzyme-controlled reactions to generate more ATP and end products or byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. Now, at higher, it is the same process. We're just going to be looking at it in a little bit more detail. So instead of referring to the process of fermentation, at higher level we call that glycolysis, which this PowerPoint is going to focus on. In terms of the sequence of events that sees the pyruvate being further broken down to release the ATP, carbon dioxide and water, we look at that in 2 extra stages called the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. These 2 stages will be covered in subsequent PowerPoints. Cellular respiration is a series of metabolic pathways that brings about the release of energy from a foodstuff and the regeneration of the high energy compound adenosine triphosphate, otherwise known as ATP. To begin the respiration journey, we look at the first stage, which is called glycolysis. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose to pyruvate in the cytoplasm of the cell. A molecule of ATP, otherwise known as adenosine triphosphate, is composed of adenosine and 3 inorganic phosphate groups as shown on the screen in front of you. Energy held in an ATP molecule is released when the bond attaching the terminal phosphate or the third phosphate is broken down by enzyme action. This results in the formation of adenosine diphosphate or ADP and an inorganic phosphate that can be seen on the right hand side of the image. On the other hand, energy is required to regenerate ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. So we have a relationship between these 2 molecules, that ATP can be broken down, releasing energy to form ADP, or in the reverse, ADP can be regenerated using energy to form ATP. Phosphorylation is an enzyme-controlled process by which a phosphate group is added to a molecule. The image on the screen in front of you is showing an example of phosphorylation. So if we look to the left-hand side of the image, we can see that ADP is having a phosphoryl group or a phosphate group attached. So the ADP is undergoing phosphorylation. So when a molecule is having this phosphoryl group or a phosphate group added, we talk about it undergoing phosphorylation. As a result, ATP is produced. Phosphorylation also occurs when phosphate and energy are transferred from ATP to the molecules of a reactant in a metabolic pathway. This makes them more reactive. So in the early stages of respiration, some reactants must undergo phosphorylation during what is called the energy investment phase. A little bit of a quick recap from National 5 learning when we looked at fermentation. We will now be referring to this stage as glycolysis at higher level. From National 5, we identified that this stage occurred in the cytoplasm of the cell. It required no oxygen, and through the process of the enzyme-controlled reactions, we saw glucose being broken down to 2 pyruvate molecules. Some ATP was produced, but not a lot. The process of cellular respiration begins in the cytoplasm of a living cell, with a molecule of glucose being broken down to form pyruvate. This process of glucose splitting is called glycolysis. It consists of a series of enzyme-controlled steps. In the first half of the chain, there is what is called an energy investment phase, where 2 ATP are used per molecule of glucose to begin the reaction. In the second half of the chain, before pyruvate is produced, we talk about an energy payoff phase, where 4 ATP are produced as a result of the reaction. The generation of 4 ATP that occurs during the second half of the pathway gives what we call a net gain of 2 ATP per molecule of glucose during glycolysis. In addition, during the energy payoff phase, hydrogen ions are released from the substrate by a dehydrogenase enzyme. These hydrogen ions are passed to a coenzyme molecule called NAD, resulting in the formation of NADH. The process of glycolysis does not require oxygen. However, NADH only leads to the production of further molecules of ATP at a later stage in the respiratory process if oxygen is present. The mnemonic oil rig that has appeared on the screen stands for oxidation is losing, reduction is gaining. What we're looking at here is the reaction that involves the hydrogen ions being lost from the substrates of the glycolysis pathway. The substrates are losing hydrogen ions, so we call that an oxidative process. But the hydrogen ions have to be accepted or gained by another substance, in this instance, coenzyme NAD. When the coenzyme NAD has gained the hydrogen ions, we talk about it as being reduced. As we've talked about in the last slide, there are 2 stages to the process of glycolysis. In the first half of the chain, we have what's called the energy investment phase, and in the second half of the chain, we have an energy payoff phase. If we can look at the first stage to begin with, we have the energy investment phase. Now, as the name would suggest, ATP is being invested here. This is a process of phosphorylation. So adenosine triphosphate is required for the phosphorylation of glucose in the first half of glycolysis. And what we see here is that the ATP passes over its phosphate group and its energy to allow glucose and intermediate molecules in that phase to undergo this breakdown reaction, this oxidative process. 2 molecules of ATP are invested per glucose molecule at this stage. In the second half of glycolysis, we see the energy payoff phase, where 4 ATP are produced per molecule of glucose. The generation of 4 ATP that occurs during the second half of the glycolysis pathway gives rise to a net gain of 2 ATP. So 2 are invested, 4 are paid off, so that's why we talk about a net gain of 2 ATP. As a result of glycolysis, we not only have a net gain of 2 ATP, but we also have NADH, which goes on to play a role in a later stage of respiration, and we also generate 2 pyruvate molecules. So as an overview, in the energy investment phase, starting from the glucose, 2 ATP are invested or used to start the reaction. The process of phosphorylation also occurs at this point, where the 1-phosphate from the ATP is passed to intermediate molecules in the glycolysis stage. We then have the energy payoff phase, where we see 4 ATP formed, 2 invested, 4 formed, giving us a net gain of 2 ATP. We see the production of 2 NADH, because the glucose has lost hydrogen ions and they've been accepted by what we call a coenzyme, and the formation of 2 molecules of pyruvate. I would ask you now to evaluate your own learning against the 4 learning intentions shown on the screen.